Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Trump's trip to Asia had been building for quite a long time. For months in the background, the United States had been communicating with China on trade cooperation in areas such as rare earths, agriculture, and semiconductors. Last week, we finally saw Trump take the flight to Asia, and there are many takeaways that we can take from the trip. The biggest question is, did this trip involve meaningful negotiations and results, or was this yet another Trump strategy that was painted like a success when the reality was less clear? Let's break it down in today's episode. Before diving into the details, let's set the context. Firstly, what did Trump get up to during this Asia trip? On the Sunday, Trump was in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia, where he oversaw the signing of an agreement between Cambodia and Thailand over their border dispute. Trump met with leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also known as ASEAN, and Trump notably held meetings with Brazilian President Lula. Relations between the two nations have been strained, with the United States pushing a 50% tariff on imports from Brazil. The Supreme Court last week voted to remove this 50% tariff on Brazilian imports, so some progress in coming weeks could be made here, especially because Trump and Lula agreed to meet again in the future. Trump spent Monday and Tuesday of his Asia trip in Japan. He headed to the Imperial Palace on Monday, where he met Emperor Naruhito. On Tuesday, Trump visited the Akasaka Palace, where he met with Japan's new Prime Minister. Trump notably stated that, quote, "Anytime you have any question, any doubt, anything you want, any favours you need, anything I can do to help Japan, we will be there," end quote. Trump also met with family members of Japanese people who were abducted by the North Koreans decades ago during this meeting. Trump then had lunch with the Japanese Prime Minister before addressing troops on the USS George Washington, which was docked at Yokosuka Port near Yokohama, Japan. At the end of the day, Trump addressed business leaders from top Japanese companies, including Toyota. Moving on to Wednesday, and this was spent in Gyeongju in South Korea. Trump, first of all, gave a speech to chief executives and business leaders, and he then met with President Lee Jae-myung of South Korea at a welcome ceremony that was held at Gyeongju National Museum. On Thursday, we saw the highly anticipated Trump-Xi meeting occur. Immediately after this, Trump then left and headed back to Washington. There was a lot that happened in the few days during Trump's visit to Asia, but the meeting between Trump and Xi naturally stole the headlines. But there was a lot more that actually came out of Trump's Asia visit outside of his meeting with Xi. Some of these events saw Trump come out as a winner, and some saw him emerge as a loser. Firstly, we're going to break down the areas why Trump came out a winner and the potential ripple effects that could come from these moves. Firstly, we saw Trump flattered massively throughout his trip in Asia. In Malaysia, 100 dancers greeted him on a red carpet. In Japan, he was gifted the late former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's golf clubs, and the Japanese Prime Minister announced her intention to nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. When Trump landed in Busan, South Korea, the YMCA was performed, which was a song that was common at Trump's rallies as far back as a decade ago. And South Korean President Lee Jae-myung also gave Trump a replica of a golden crown. Trump then also received a gold medal and South Korea's highest civilian honour. Nations that need Trump ultimately turn on the charm to keep him on side. But ultimately, if the charm offensive doesn't work, a batch of transactional diplomacy always typically helps. Luckily for Trump, that also came with his trip to Asia. In his first stop in Malaysia, Trump signed framework pacts with Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And as I stated earlier, he agreed to continue trade talks in the future with Brazil. The 11 member nations of ASEAN export more to the United States than they do to China. As a result of this, they are vulnerable to Trump's tariff policy. Since these nations have high exports to the United States, they possess trade surpluses with the United States. The Liberation Day tariffs were formulated to eliminate the United States' trade deficit with other nations, which for these Asian nations is the equivalent of their trade surplus. As a result of the Southeast Asian nations having high exports to the United States, their initial tariff rates from Liberation Day were very high. As a result of this, many of these Southeast Asian nations wanted to formulate deals. Now, Trump is pushing to increase US resiliency, and a part of that pivot is to increase manufacturing domestically in the United States. This is because control of supply chains gives a nation protection, and it also gives them options, which is a benefit that China possesses across a range of vital traded goods, especially rare earths. The United States is pursuing this resiliency because they don't want this Chinese power to be weaponized against them. As a part of this pivot to US resiliency, Vietnam pledged to increase its US purchases, and Malaysia and Thailand signed deals on a framework to diversify critical mineral supply chains. Another contributing factor to the Southeast Asian nations making deals with the United States is that these states constantly seek to balance relations between China's expanding sphere of influence and the only other global superpower who is on level with the Chinese, and that's the United States. Also, Southeast Asia is, as I've discussed, connected to the United States in trade, but the area also remains reliant on China for demand. As a result, these nations will continue to interact with both China and the United States, as was seen at last week's summits at ASEAN and APEC. But these weren't the only deals that were formulated during Trump's visit to Asia. The Japanese and the Americans advanced earlier trade negotiations that would see lower US tariffs on Japan, as well as a framework to secure the mining and processing of rare earths and other critical minerals. A memorandum of understanding was also signed between Japan and the United States, with the focus of this memorandum of understanding being on scientific and technological cooperation. Trump, once again, has seen another deal signed because of the pressure of using the tariffs as a negotiation strategy. Of course, the reason that this worked is because Japan needs the United States, specifically for security. The final deal that I'd like to discuss that was signed during Trump's Asia trip is the deal with South Korea. This deal garnered more headlines than the Japan deal, and rightly so. A deadlocked $350 billion trade deal was pushed over the line, and this included $200 billion in cash investment from South Korea and a $150 billion shipbuilding deal. A point to note in regard to shipbuilding, there exists a US law called the Jones Act. The Jones Act, which is also known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, requires that all goods transported by water from one US port to another must be done so by ships that are manufactured in the United States, that are crewed by US citizens, owned by US citizens, and that fly the US flag. But in recent decades, the domestic shipbuilding industry in the United States has declined. It's a debate that has existed for years as to whether the Jones Act is necessary today, and this debate will continue to exist. But this South Korea deal has now become a significant part of this debate. In December of 2024, South Korea's Hanwha Ocean completed a $100 million acquisition of the US shipbuilder Philly shipyard. This allows Hanwha Ocean to enter the Jones Act market and to expand its presence in the United States commercial and government shipbuilding. It's a smart business decision because if the Jones Act remains in place, the United States will naturally need more ships as it pushes to increase domestic manufacturing. The demand for more shipbuilding is also seen in the order backlog of Hanwha Philly Shipyard, as they are now known, which totals $1.6 billion. The Jones Act could undergo some amendments in the future, but this deal will ultimately benefit both sides. South Korea has a strong shipbuilding industry that can flourish in the United States, and the United States, in return, will likely see ships built quicker than before this deal was made. Even if the shipbuilding segment of this trade deal doesn't come to fruition, $200 billion in cash investment speaks volumes. On top of this, South Korea also received US approval to commission a South Korean nuclear-powered submarine, which will be built in a US shipyard. We saw the Australians receive a similar deal as a part of AUKUS. Finally, as Japan and the United States did, the South Koreans and the United States also signed a memorandum of understanding for scientific and technical cooperation. Now, this sounds like a lot of wins for Trump during his Asia trip, but we haven't yet discussed the main story that involved Trump meeting with President Xi. Ultimately, it wasn't all wins for Trump in Asia. Is the meeting with Xi ultimately where Trump lost out? Relations between the United States and China, as I've been discussing quite frequently in many previous episodes, have been worsening. This will continue to be a long-term trend, where the two nations shift between environments of competition and environments of conflict. To complicate this even further, this is unfolding simultaneously in multiple hybrid realms. But today, we're going to focus only on trade. The two nations were recently in an escalating environment of conflict, and they were causing pain to each other. We're seeing Donald Trump pursue leverage domestically, while also seeking to pivot the United States to a system of greater resiliency. He's doing this through tariffs, since it brings nations to the negotiating table. We've seen this with the deals made with South Korea and Japan, because in making deals with Trump, it ensures that they retain the security that the United States provides. In a summary, the existence of any deal that the United States makes with any other nation highlights that Trump and the United States have leverage over these nations. The number of deals that Trump signed in Asia does demonstrate that this strategy is working, and that nations are offering Trump and the United States favourable deals. Unfortunately for Trump, this existence of leverage doesn't apply to all nations. This strategy fails when Trump and the United States don't have more leverage over a nation than that nation has over the United States. In the trade realm, the United States does have leverage over the Chinese, but China possesses greater leverage over the United States. It's this issue that reinforces the constant cycle between competition and conflict, and until one side builds enough resiliency from being hurt by the other, this cycle will continue. If the recent US-China meeting had to be summed up with a metaphor, neither side has given up its weapons, but they have promised to stop firing for now. As a result, this meeting represents more of a ceasefire than a permanent peace. Despite a de-escalation in this trade conflict as a result of the meeting, I believe that Trump came out of this meeting at a loss. This de-escalation gives China more time to continue to build its trade advantages, while it gives the United States time to address its trade disadvantages. As a result of this, China always negotiates from a position of strength, while the United States negotiates from a position of weakness. Another area where the United States ultimately lost from this trade meeting is that China didn't give anything up. Tariffs will be reduced from a suspected 57% to 47%. This is because China has committed to attempting to limit the amount of fentanyl entering the United States. But it's notable that during the period of 145% tariffs that the United States placed on China, it was the United States who backed down from this and eventually lowered the tariffs. The Chinese continued to match Trump. As a part of this deal, China will also resume buying soybeans from the United States, which has been a major issue for American farmers. Again, this was a United States disadvantage, and making a deal here appeals to them. This is, of course, success, but the power here sits in China's hands. They could once again very easily pivot to buying soybeans from Brazil. Also, restrictions on rare earth exports were scaled back, but the restrictions that were introduced in April still remain. Trump, in return, scaled back some of the United States' own export restrictions. China once again comes out of this specific part of the deal as a winner, because we can see how much Trump and the United States are scrambling for rare earths and critical minerals. In an escalating trade environment that pivots from competition to conflict once again, China can reintroduce these measures. As I've discussed in the last few episodes, the uses of rare earths and critical minerals are especially notable. They are vital in the military industry and among other vital areas in which the United States possesses notable advantages over China, such as semiconductors. If China has large control over these minerals and the processing of these minerals, then they can weaponize this supply chain against the United States. China ultimately holds trade leverage over the United States because of its sheer control of global supply chains. Also, building new mines and expanding processing capacity takes years. Trump likely won't even see the rewards of these efforts during his term, but it ultimately needs to be done to limit this weapon that China holds over the United States. Getting a reprieve from some rare earth controls is a win for Trump, but this still remains a clear environment of vulnerability for the United States today. Most notably, this is only a 1-year reprieve. As a part of this trade deal, a 1-year timeline was set. The United States could once again need to negotiate with China this time next year. This deal also wasn't finalised. Trump will visit China next April, which will be followed by a meeting with Xi heading to Washington or Florida. We can see a lot happen before next April, and this includes entering into another environment of trade escalation and trade conflict. Now, in discussing leverage when it comes to trade, this isn't to say that the United States is dominated completely by China. The United States, of course, could respond in ways that would hurt China too. But both nations remain dependent on each other and interconnected. This ensures that they are vulnerable to each other, and as a result, they will continue to pursue resiliency against the weapons that the other possesses. Until one side grows less vulnerable to the other, we are set to remain in this cycle. Trump made many deals in Asia that will benefit the United States, but the meeting with Xi and the Chinese was the most important, and for now, it remains a loss for Trump and the United States. The meeting resembled more of a truce than a sizable shift in relations, and this truce could very easily be reversed. In a meeting that was focused only on trade, China retained the structural advantages that give it more leverage in many trade-related issues. China has trade advantages because of the sheer market share and control that it possesses over global supply chains. And with this meeting being focused on trade, China ultimately had more cards. In my opinion, the biggest takeaway is that China has bought more time to put themselves in a position of greater strength, while the United States continues down this long road to resiliency. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. It really helps out the podcast. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.